Hello and welcome to the Reporters and the Reportage podcast
with Maddie Balcon and Rhiannon Eves.
Each episode is brought to you by the MA Journalism students of 2023, and we will be bringing you key insights to the industry from industry professionals. And today we are joined by Richard Sambrook.
Hello.
Hello. So Richard was a journalist for the BBC for about 30 years. He was also the Director of Global News. He is Emeritus Professor at the Cardiff University here and a co-chair of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and a chair of the Frontline Club. So it's amazing.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us
Pleasure to be here.
So your lecture today that you spoke to us about was all about impartiality. So with events that's going on in the Middle East at the moment, how difficult is it for news organisations to remain impartial? And do you still think it's fundamental for public service broadcasters to stay that way?
Yes, it's absolutely essential for public service broadcasters to be impartial. And quickly, the reason for that is that they are funded by all of the public, and therefore all of the public who pay for them need to feel that their views and their interests are represented in some way. So if public service broadcasters were to, take one position on something, they would be excluding a lot of their audience and excluding a lot of the people who pay for them. So impartiality is crucial for public service broadcasters. In conflicts like we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment, or in the past we've seen in Northern Ireland and in other places, it is incredibly difficult. It's a very, very complex and tricky thing to try and get right, and it's controversial because there are plenty of people who don't understand the need for news organisations to be impartial, or who want to recruit a news organisation to their side of the conflict or their side of the argument in order to, hopefully buoy up that side of things. And for broadcasters to stay impartial, they need to explain their position and why, but they also need to be pretty robust about the way they do it. At the moment, for example, in terms of what's happening in the Middle East, there is a lot of controversy over whether or not major news organisations should call Hamas a terrorist organisation. And most of them prefer to call Hamas a militant organisation or to some other neutral term, whilst not underplaying the terrorist acts that have taken place. And that's quite a difficult thing for some people to accept or to recognise. How do you avoid calling them terrorism without sanitising what's happened? Well, I think there are ways of doing it and there are reasons for it. But the reasons news organisations try and stay impartial is not to get recruited to one side of the conflict or the other, because they have to work across both. And for an international broadcaster like the BBC, or for an organisation like Reuters that serves clients all over the world and on all sides of opinion and all sides of divides, it's important that they don't exclude one or another by the language that they use. Also, news organisations have to put their staff into places where if they had been siding with one side, it would be increasingly dangerous and increasingly unable to operate on the other side of the lines. So it's an important principle. It's been there for a long time. It's shared across a lot of news organisations, but it is complex and it is controversial.
And then thinking beyond the Middle East as well, do you think you've seen a change in recent years about how challenging it is to remain impartial about social issues such as like transgender rights and Black Lives Matter, things like that?
Definitely. I think the rise of identity politics, has made things difficult. People feel these issues very personally. They're kind of integral to who they feel they are. And therefore, to be able to put those feelings aside in order to become impartial is quite tricky. But also just reporting around those issues becomes incredibly sensitive and controversial, particularly around the trans issue, obviously, but also on gender and race too. And I think that's exacerbated to some extent by social media or by the general rise in opinion and opinion journalism, where everybody wants to sound off and where, it's more about noise, if you like, and more about heat than it is about light and explanation. So trying to get beyond the noise and beyond the heat in order to be able to do some kind of cool and rational analysis and explanation becomes increasingly difficult.
And you mentioned there about social media. So do you think the reliance on social media has changed the journalistic landscape? And if so, do you think it's changed it for the better or for the worse?
Well, I think it's mixed. I mean, social media is, a very significant part of the media landscape today. I think overall that's a good thing. It means everyone has access to public space and public debate and can express their views, and it's good for freedom of expression and interests, and individuals who otherwise would have struggled to get their voices heard now can be heard. All of that is very positive, but I think it has become divisive, and it has polarized opinion because, a lot of the algorithms behind social media favor controversy, favor hate, favor, emotion, and that actually makes it difficult sometimes for, again, the kind of cool, rational, or impartial voices to get heard. And I also think there's so much opinion there, and it is so easy to access that, as news organisations have made cuts in the newsrooms and all the rest of it, it's a shortcut. Well, we'll go on to X, as it now is, or Twitter, or we'll go onto Facebook and we'll find some views there and we'll put something together. It's very easy and very cheap to do that, but it's not, in my view, real journalism, which should be on the ground, finding evidence, interviewing people, and not making the mistake of thinking social media represents public opinion, because it doesn't.
So thinking about that and about public opinion on social media, in 2020 you were asked to review the BBC's social media guidelines, and they have been updated again since then. But how important do you think it is that journalists themselves are impartial on their social media platforms?
I think there are lots of different kinds of journalists, of course, but I think if you work for a public service broadcaster like the BBC, or indeed any of the other broadcasters that are regulated to be impartial, it's essential. If you work for a newspaper, it matters less, because all newspapers tend to have political positions and everyone understands that. But if you work for a regulated, impartial broadcaster and you work in news, then I think it's essential that you remain impartial, and that means being careful what you tweet on personal accounts as well as obviously on professional accounts, because people can work out who you work for. Being careful about what posts you like, who you follow. All sorts of people will make inferences from these things about your political views. So you've got to think about that and be careful about it, and think very clearly and hard about the language that you use, because people can appear to be partial or appear to be biased without meaning to, simply by being too quick in what they're saying or not thinking it through well enough. So there are all sorts of pitfalls and traps around it. It's very important for news organisations and journalists to be on social media because it's such an important platform. But I think if you work in a regulated, impartial broadcaster, you have to tread very carefully.
And obviously you've had such an extensive career within journalism. Other than impartiality and, the change from digital journalism, what else do you think is the biggest change from when you started to now?
Well, I suppose the biggest change is just as a result of the change in technology, is the amount of media there is. It's hugely competitive, hugely crowded now. So when I started my career many decades ago in the South Wales Valleys here on local newspapers, basically, I was on a weekly newspaper in the Rhondda Valley. It came out once a week and you wrote what you could find or what you thought would interest people, and that was it. And people didn't like it, they'd come up to you in the street or whatever, but, it was pretty straightforward. But there wasn't digital, there wasn't social media, and by and large, newspapers were very profitable. Well, they're not profitable now. Local newspapers in particular have really suffered. Even national newspapers are changing. Everything is moving online. Business models are changing. It's very difficult to make a viable, sustainable business model now, and therefore, it's a lot harder.
As you just touched on there, your journalism career has obviously been very extensive and very impressive as well. Would you say there's a story that you've worked on in your career that's really stuck with you over the years?
I guess I would have to say it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, where I went out as a producer for BBC News on the night the wall came down, and was there for 6 weeks reporting on the immediate aftermath and consequences of that. But it sticks in my mind because it was a real sense that you were witnessing history. This was a moment in history, the collapsing of the wall, the bringing down of the restrictions between East and West, and there was a real sense of kind of geopolitics and seismic change going on. It was also very largely a kind of happy story because people were celebrating everywhere. It was, families were reunited. It felt like a very positive thing. Now, long term, we might say that there were all sorts of consequences that we didn't recognise then to the reunification of Germany and the Western values perhaps overcoming Soviet values and all the rest of it. But it was a very profound story and therefore obviously one that I remember vividly.
And just to wrap up, do you have any advice for anyone that's kind of looking to break into the industry or trainee journalists like ourselves?
Yeah, you have to be incredibly flexible. You have to master all sorts of skills, not just the basic skills of who, what, where, when, why in your journalism, but you've got to be able to do audio, you've got to be able to do video, you've got to be able to understand data, you've got to be able to soon to understand AI as well. So you have to be incredibly flexible about things. But I think beneath that, you just have to be relentlessly curious. That's what makes good journalism, is being open-minded and always asking, well, why is that, or how is that, or what else is that might, be interesting around this topic or this issue. Being open-minded and relentlessly curious is really the secret to it.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us today. We're definitely going to take all of your advice on with us to hopefully have a successful career in journalism. So thank you very much.
Well, good luck with it. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you.